Hello, this is Property Matters, a weekly catch-up on all matters property, supported by Fairview International Property Consultancy and auctionproperty.co.uk. And we're live every Sunday at 10 a.m. on YouTube, Facebook, and on our website, propertymatterstv.co.uk. And if you're watching on our website, we'd love you to leave us a quick Google review. That'd be very nice. Just hit on the review button and leave us a short review. Please get involved by adding your comments in the comments section below today. And if you'd like to email us, it's hello@propertymatterstv.co.uk. Property Matters is also a podcast every Monday after the Sunday broadcast, and you'll find it on all of the platforms listed over on the side there. So let's take a look at this week's property news with our property expert, Joe Joshi. Morning, Joe.
Yes, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Well, it's good to see the sun is out there a little bit. Makes it all a little bit more brighter and cheerful, doesn't it, for a Sunday morning, Paul, as we have to get up so early to do this fantastic show that we do.
So let's go straight into it then with our first story. A YouGov poll has revealed that nearly half of adults in Britain would be in favour of abolishing the leasehold system on home ownership. The survey found 28% of respondents strongly supported the proposal, while 19% said that they would somewhat support the move. Some 7% were somewhat opposed, and 3% expressed strong opposition, whilst 43% were undecided. Makes you think that perhaps some of them didn't even know what the leasehold system was, perhaps.
Yeah, it's an age-old issue here, Paul, with leaseholds and ownerships and so forth. But it was devised, obviously, hundreds of years ago for many different reasons. And now it's sort of, rears its head again for various parts of the leasehold process, leasehold properties, the ownership, how that works, and why it's a good thing and why it's a bad thing. Obviously, our man at the leveling up section is obviously out to do everything he can or to level up. I'm not quite sure what he's leveling up at some side moment in time, but he's certainly where possible, having a go at either leaseholds or tenants or landlords or anyone else that he thinks that now deserves his attention. So the leasehold scenario here is a two-way thing, Paul. People know freehold. Freehold is always something that we feel is something that we own, the land it's built on and all that is on it. The leasehold situation occurs because someone else owns the freehold, or there's a multiple occupancies. For example, let's say there's a block of flats of 6 or 10 people in there, or 100, and in some cases, then what happens is the land it's actually built on that block is a freehold, and that freeholder may be someone different to those that are now the leaseholder, and that freeholder gives out historically a 99-year lease or a 125-year lease, or in some cases with a peppercorn rent of 999-year leases. And there were various reasons why these were created, and we can go through those on a one-to-one point basis. But now the way things are talking about it is just that the shorter the leases are left. For example, if it's a 99-year lease and it's now dropped down to maybe, I don't know, say below 60, it becomes challenging for refinancing, it becomes challenging for selling. And of course, those are the reasons why it is now come back into the limelight about making sure that everybody either has a share of the freehold or have the chance to have a longer lease.
Yeah, Gove has definitely got it in for leasehold in principle. He says that the system is unfair and that in crude terms, if you buy a flat, that should be yours. You shouldn't be on the hook for charges that managing agents and other people can land with you. So he obviously clearly doesn't agree with the system. And I think, the notion that you have a leasehold on a house that's built on a piece of land and you're the only person occupying that piece of land, then why should that land belong to somebody else when you've bought the house? But I can see the argument, like you said, with like 100 block of flats on one piece of land. Do they have 100th each? I mean, how does that work in common hold, for example?
So let's pick up the point on the house first. And there was a time when perhaps a farm or a family trust or somebody would have owned the land that they then managed to get planning permission on maybe 100 years ago to issue leases on it. Now, the reason why the leases were originally created were because of what we call crystallization. It meant that they physically didn't sell the freehold and subsequently wouldn't be paying tax on the sale of the freehold, but created a lease so that basically they still owned the freehold and actually sold off a lease aspect. That's how it was originally devised and designed, to the best of my knowledge. That it just meant that let's say you owned a piece of land and you decided to get planning permission and sell it. But if you had sold the freehold of that aspect of that land, you would have been liable to pay a capital gains or some tax levy for crystallizing that asset in the first place. However, you haven't. You've kept it, and therefore you haven't crystallized it, and then there you're not going to pay. But what you do is create a long lease and sell the lease aspect of it. So theoretically, you haven't sold the freehold. Now, there, I agree that obviously, if it's a house and it's the only property on it, then why not let the person that is owning the lease have the opportunity to buy the freehold? They're normally only paying a peppercorn rent. A peppercorn rent could be like a penny. It's just a token gesture to show that there is the difference between the freehold and the leasehold. The only problem with leasehold and freehold is that every time somebody wants to do something, they will have to take the freeholder's consent. Now, that also could be relevant to a property that may have a chunk of land with it. It might be that it has a covenant on there to say that they can only have the one property that is built on it. But if they choose to build another property on it later on in life, then the person who owns the freehold will have the right to have some compensation for the fact that they're going to have the privilege of building another property and thus gaining a profit. So those are the sort of the nuts and bolts of why the leasehold freehold existed in general, especially where single dwellings were concerned, like a home. When it comes to flats, or a block of flats, or hundreds of flats, then the problem with that is that who's going to be responsible? Now, that there, it's hard for Mr. Gove to convince anybody and everybody that this person is liable and this person. You can't really theoretically own a freehold of a flat in the middle of the air. It's like having a brick in the wall. So you say, oh, that particular brick in that wall is mine. So how do you get to that brick? You've got to get through the system. You've got to get through the common areas. You've got to, you're not going to fly into it. There is some sort of commonality that has to happen. So the way that is now being dealt with is primarily that everybody can have the share of the freehold. So there isn't actually a freeholder per se separately, but they might have, so let's say there's 100 flats, they all might have 10% or 1% share in the company that owns that freehold. So they can almost self-administrate a extension of the lease or the costs or the maintenance costs or the ground rent or whatever they want to do. They always self-maintain that. And then each time that property is sold, the share of that company is sold with that property. So the next owner has the same rights as everybody else. That's kind of the way things are going forward. Whereas until now, it hasn't been that way. That's not how it is.
Yeah, Gove said last weekend that his government plans would be able to make it easier for leaseholders of flats to bring their buildings into common ownership to avoid paying ground rents and management fees. It's another popular area for the government to try and win favour with people, because they've already had a knock at landlords for overcharging tenants, and now they're suggesting that these freeholders, to try and get some balance in the discussion, are overcharging the leaseholders, I guess, for these management fees. And we have had stories of where that happens, and certainly I think isn't it a unique system to the UK, because common ownership is very common in Europe, for example, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. It was just designed, like I said, originally it was designed probably to avoid paying tax. That's how it was probably originally set up, but it's become historical, and it is where it is. Now, when you look at the aspect of maintenance and service charges and all those things, you imagine having 100 people in a block. There's always going to be one pool. not one, but there's probably loads of them, but there's always one that will disagree with that what is being put together. And that one person could create nothing but havoc for the other 99 people that might be in the block. For example, don't want to be participating in the common area for cleaning, don't want to pay for this, don't want to do this, don't like that, don't like this. And before you know it, that area becomes rubbish. And unfortunately, first impressions count. Somebody coming to buy a flat, let's imagine you had a flat in that same block, but the whole common area was so terrible because none of you could come to an agreement as to what the charges were going to be. No one did anything. You're the losers because at the end of the day, the next guy who's going to walk through those doors and say, I wouldn't mind living here, is probably going to say, God, I don't want to live there because they haven't got their act together. So there is a minus and a plus. So sometimes it's actually good to have a separate management company who then take responsibility for the common areas, deal with all those issues, and do it in harmony with others. Yes, of course, there's a charge. There's always going to be a charge. And I think Gove is kind of wrong with that in saying, oh, we've got to get rid of this, because I think there are some situations everywhere in the country that just wouldn't work. I mean, it just wouldn't happen. I mean, some of these blocks that have been built, the towers in London, for example, it's near impossibility. It makes it even harder for those landlords and other leaseholders when a person has decided to rent it out and doesn't live in the country, who is part of the share of that freehold or is part of that whole block. And the tenant that they put in there is a very difficult tenant for the rest of them. And it just goes on and on and on. So there's so many reasons which I don't think he's actually thought about. It's just easy to open your mouth and say, well, actually, I think we should have a reform on that. But a good percentage of people will be very, very cautious in how that is done. Yes, it does need some sort of reform. There's no doubt about it. And I think there should be some sort of policing in how that is dealt with. But I'm not quite sure that you've got to just abolish the fact that it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, the legal profession agrees with you. You'll be pleased to hear, Joe. They've poured cold water on the prospect of the leasehold system being abolished altogether. One property expert said the abolition of the leasehold system in its entirety is unlikely. To reform the reform to improve the system and its operation going forward is highly likely and very much needed. So exactly what you just said there. And in a nutshell, Joe, what are the biggest problems with it as it stands at the moment?
I think the biggest problems is the service charges can be excessive, especially on some of the recent newer built blocks, perhaps in the last 15, 20 years, where they thought, what, we can whack big service charges. That makes it really hard to sell, especially when you think the current cost of living the way it is. You have your mortgage going up, you've got all your other costs going up, and then there's a service charge on a block. Now, there's no issue to a large extent paying those service charges if the work was being done, and you will find that there isn't. So, for example, recently you will see that we've had these things with the facades, the fascias of the buildings for the fire risks and so forth, since the Glenfield Tower having the fire. And those service charges, those insurances they've collected are not actually being counted. They're not standing up and saying, well, actually, we've collected all this money, and we will deal with this. They want the government to deal with it. And I think that's what's really brought this whole situation to the government's attention, because people are saying the government's got to cough up to pay for all these things. And really, I've always said that they've collected those insurances and service charges for some time, and those people should be the one, or the insurance company should be the one that should be paying up for all these things. So the biggest problems currently today, I think, are things like that, and having block management by people that are probably not managing them. There's also a case where there's a lot of absentee landlords. So in other words, someone somewhere has put a security up of that particular building. Maybe they have had a misfortunate circumstance where they're now no longer part of that, or it's been taken by a receiver or someone else, and so no one really has the direct contact for who is actually responsible. So collectively, it becomes a bit of a ghetto because nobody really cares. And those are the problems that I think that actually are currently stronger issues. Cost of the ground rent, cost of the service charges, cost of the insurances, and nobody actually taking responsibility to deal with the problems.
Well, we will be able to see fairly shortly when the proposals come to fruition exactly what happens, and we will keep up with that story, of course, here on Property Matters. One of the things that the government will be pleased to see, although whether they've had anything to do with it, I'm not sure, the north-south house price divide remains considerable, but the gap has started to close, driven by higher rates of house price growth seen across the north during the pandemic property market boom, as well as growing market sentiment as a result of the government's announcement of the Levelling Up Fund. New research shows from a company called EXP UK. So the company analysed the divide based on the far higher prices found in the south, of course, against the more affordable costs for property found across the West and East Midlands, the North West, Yorkshire and Humberside, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And the study found that there remains a clear divide, with the average house price across the south currently 404,869. What's more, every region south of the divide is home to an average house price north of 300,000. In contrast, the average house price across the north is currently 209,404, with the West Midlands coming in with the highest average house price of 256,937. Based on these property market parameters, the research by the company shows that the north-south divide in property values remains a notable 93.3%. Surely, Joe, that all of the reason for the narrowing of the divide is that people are looking for bargains further afield.
Not sure there's such a big narrowing there, to be honest with you, Paul. I mean, it's probably not even worth mentioning. I mean, the north-south divide really is a north-south divide. And yes, the levelling up, people think that they're actually making some inroads, but really they're not making any inroads at all. The south is by far the most popular. We know that for many a reason, mostly because the bright lights of London or any big city makes it easier. Jobs are more available. Travel, communication, and so forth has been much better. And just generally, the south has been always more popular than perhaps the north. Not that there's anything wrong with the north. It's just that I think that's what happened. In fact, it's the north that continues to come down. Occasionally, people do tend to sort of go up. And there are reasons for that. Partly because there's family connections, partly because sometimes people are going to downsize and they might think, okay, well, I moved from the north to the south. I've now done my bit down the south. I made some good money on a property. I can actually sell this property, clear my mortgage, and I can go to the north, back to my roots, and get a better value, go back to the home area, and live freely. So, that is the reason. I mean, obviously during the pandemic, you may have remembered that there was a big rush to go towards the north, or out of London, primarily because this whole thing of COVID-19 was going to be the be all and end all. But in all honesty, what was COVID-19 to a large extent? You think about what we went through to where we are. Most people were not. It's a bit like the other word called Brexit. I mean, it's these are things that happen in the journey, but right now it's about people where they're comfortable. And I think that the north-south divide will maintain, unless, of course, they really do create some job structures that makes people think, well, actually, I'm better off living in the north on the basis that I've got the job that I want and I can afford to pay off the mortgage and work this way. There are so many reasons that are just beyond our control. There's nothing you and I or anybody can do about it. It is where the attraction is, and that's what the divide will continue to do. These figures that are coming in saying there's 97%. I mean, we're talking nonsense numbers, really. In what is the difference, and primarily that is, I think, down to family structures, jobs, and communication, and younger generations. They want to go to London.
Yeah, they certainly do. And actually, looking at the figures that we've got on screen at the moment, showing a chart of figures from 2012, 2020, and 2022. So if you looked at the inflation-adjusted north-south divide in 2012, it was 79%. And by 2020, it had rocketed to 97%. And it's eased back in 2 years to 93.3. And as you say, I think the race for space, as people moving around and trying to find bargains on the coast and maybe up north, because they could get more space without having to probably fork out a lot more money, that's probably helped to spread the load more across the country. But you can see In actual fact, there's a misprint in this particular thing. So the second line should actually read the south, not the north twice, as you can see on the screen there. So the percentage change for the north is 7.8% and only 5.8% in the south. So the fact that the south is growing slower than the north by 2%, and as you say, it is small margins, but it is quite a shock, isn't it? 79% to 97% in what, 18 years? No, 8 years, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a subject to talk about, but if you actually look at the numbers, it doesn't make good conversation really, because I mean it would have been more exciting if the numbers were much wider, as opposed to 93 to 97%, from 97 to 93, and 2 or 3% is not something really that great. But the idea of having people that are living in the north and divide that divide exists. It's really down to the fact that I think wherever your family is and what your roots are and how you go for it. But the younger generation, even if you look at the margins of growth, there might be lesser in value growth in sometimes in London, but there's a huge demand. They know that in the long term, South will probably outperform the North in terms of capital investment gain on their property. So if you bought something at, I don't know, £300,000 in the South, the chances are it was probably going to be worth £400,000. But if you bought the same sort of thing in the North, it might only have gone up by another £10,000, £15,000. So that's the driver for people to sort of say, okay, well, it's a supply and demand port. It's this bottom is it's supply and demand. The demand is much higher in the South, and the supply is limited. So that's what the prices go for.
Yeah, the head of the company doing the research, Adam Day, says it remains a tale of two markets across the UK, with the south remaining a dominant force in terms of overall house price pedigree, while the north has enjoyed a stronger performance of late where the house price appreciation is concerned. And also, of course, because of this levelling up fund, of prospecting by investors, because they're thinking to themselves, well, if the government's going to invest in the infrastructure and the IT and so forth for the north, then I might as well get in early and hopefully see some growth on those prices when all of this infrastructure is in place.
Yeah, but that's still not happening to a large extent. I mean, more recently, even though there's been a huge surge of people going to the north during the pandemic, the value is still back in the south. Even though while we were doing our program during the pandemic, we know that the north-south divide was there. People were on the race for space, leaving the big cities, going out towards the countryside, cashing up on the properties and buying and getting more space. But when it comes down to the everyday living, and the reality is that their whole structure was based where they were in the first place. So they are tempted to be attracted back, and if they're not, their children will be, because they think, well, actually, I'd rather go back to my friends are there, my work is there, all that social networking is there, and that's what actually sometimes draws them back to where they started.
Talk about investing in the north, and this is something that we hadn't planned to speak about today, but I just reminded myself of a conversation I had at a party recently with someone who said, great tip at the moment is to invest where there's future free ports coming. So, for example, one place that was mentioned was Hull, and another one is Portsmouth. Apparently, they're both becoming free ports, or certainly Hull is, and Portsmouth is hoping to, and therefore a smart investor might consider bringing an investment into buying property around those sort of areas. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's the free ports have been sort of mulled around in many ways. I always suggest to people that follow the lines of communication in the terms of like the rail network, and look what's happened with the Elizabeth line finally got through there. It was because of the Elizabeth line that was going to be put together, the Crossrail, and that route started to do really well. Now there is obviously talk of the high speed and the HS2. Yes, there is discussion. It might stop at Acton, or it might go into central London. But the fact is that wherever the communication lines are, the routes are going to be where it is, and that's exactly what they're talking about. These free ports. It's about where there's going to be work coming in, and people maybe want to invest or buy or live in those areas, and depending on the jobs that they do. Portsmouth certainly is in the south anyway, so or the southwest. It'll probably always it doesn't do bad, but it'll do probably better with a free port. And Hull definitely, I think Hull, was a big city growing, and I think a free port would maybe give more work for people up there, and that's what really the driver is for these free ports. It's about creating more jobs, creating more employment, and obviously bringing more people back to the north and bring life back into those cities.
So, our final story today, Joe, concerns a government bonanza, and maybe this is why Liz Truss was thinking about cutting taxes. Residential stamp duty land tax, or SDLT to you and I, the receipts jumped 69% to £10.1 billion in England in the last year, according to HMRC. Home transactions grew 20% year on year to 1.2 million. In 21-22 in England, of course, the highest figures since 2007 to 8. All regions saw a year-on-year rise in residential stamp duty receipts in 2021-22. HMRC's data shows ranging from a 50% rise in London to 3.9 billion to a 117% jump in Northern Ireland to 65 million pounds. Well, there's a double-edged sword there. Obviously, they've created a lot of cash to pay back the debts that they've incurred in recent years. But, of course, the rest of us, that elusive first buy has gone even further in front of us.
Yeah, I have to say that Liz Truss wasn't thinking anything positive at all. She was pure accident that happened in every possible way that one could think about. And that's why you haven't seen hide or hair of her ever since she parted number 10 and the revolving doors at that time. So I don't think she's got anything to do with this. But the fact is that, yes, they made some good money during the pandemic. It shows that it is important for that first step to the run of the property ladder, where first-time buyers or anyone that is moving in as investors, they can have whatever break they can in order to make sure that they pay no or reduce stamp duty. But in this situation, as you have pointed out, even though they've done, a holiday for stamp duty, because of the volume of the transaction and perhaps the sizes of the transaction, because the system allows people to move up the scale, and as you go up the scale, that holiday doesn't exist, and so they've made good money out of that. But every successive government, no matter who they are, blue or red or yellow, they will all turn around and use building as the way out. And that's exactly what happened during the pandemic. It was the only part that was doing well, the building industry, and obviously reduction of stamp duty. And I wouldn't be too surprised that it wouldn't be something that would come back in again in a short space of time in order to kickstart the current sort of lull in the marketplace, primarily because of the cost of living that came in simultaneously to the increase in the bank interest rate. So, they've always historically, in all the years that I've been around in property, they've always used the stamp duty and the interest rate as the yardstick to either reduce, moving or increase moving of property, because they know that is the driver for people to say, okay, well, look, you see, I've got no stamp duty to pay. At the moment, it's £0 to £250,000. That's going to be taken out in 25, according to the figures. But it's very possible that will continue, and it's also very possible that they will increase it perhaps again, maybe to £500,000 in order to restart the market. Every government will always use the stamp duty because it is guaranteed free money that is coming in, because people in this country, beginning in the UK, everyone wants to ultimately, where possible, have a piece of their own property, and obviously not want to rent if they can, because otherwise they just lie in the pockets of other landlords. So really, it is always going to be a yardstick. And yes, they've done well to pay some of those debts back. Liz Truss created a nice hole.
So the jump in transactions followed the stamp duty relief, of course, which was launched on the 8th of July 2020 and ran to the end of June 2021. Homes valued between or below 500,000, should I say, paid no stamp duty, rising from the standard 125,000 exemption. From the 1st of July 2021 to the end of September 21, stamp duty was due on homes above 250,000. So there's no doubt about it. Coventry Building Society's head of intermediary relations said the numbers confirm what we already knew. The stamp duty holiday injected life into the market at a time of uncertainty. The reduced tax bill enabled people to move more freely, which was especially important during the pandemic when a lot of people were suddenly working from home and reassessing what their house needs were. But the one thing I wanted to talk to you about was Kwasi Kwarteng did actually say that he was permanently abolishing stamp duty for properties up to 250,000. And of course, Jeremy Hunt soon reversed that when he got into power. But that was one move that I think would have got a lot of popularity with people because there was a lot of call for stamp duty to be abolished altogether. But we realise that it's such a cash cow for them, they can't possibly do that. So why wouldn't it have been it should have been helpful, surely, to have kept that going so that the first-time buyers had a bit of a chance.
Well, like I said, that is still there until 2025. He's reversing it in 2025, to the best of my knowledge. But they will probably sustain that. And I think what they'll do probably is come back with the £500,000 point, where up to £500,000, there will be no stamp duty, just to kickstart the property market again. And that's what they did in the pandemic. That's what that's why they had it at £500,000, and that's why they've had so much money coming in. Because if you're moving upscale, so the first £500,000, I mean, even parts of London, £500,000 is standard. A 2-bedroom flat, 1-bedroom flat is £300,000-400,000. So they're already out of the 250 mark. The 250 mark may exist sort of some parts of outside the M25, and then basically towards the north. But in London, you are not going to get much for £250,000 or less. So they're all going to be paying stamp duty, and in order to kickstart that, they'll probably need to push that back to £500,000. And whilst Jeremy Hunt actually reversed it, or said he reversed it, or he will reverse it at a certain time, I think it was more about who's in charge situation. I'm here. I'm going to make everything they've done. I'm going to turn it back. But really, I'm sure he needs to rethink what's going to happen there, because if you look at the numbers that HMRC have had in stamp duty during the pandemic because of the reduction up to £500,000, perhaps they should take another look at that and say we need to increase it from 250 to £500,000, or maybe consider it as a regional thing, Paul. It might be that that happens in London properties and it's a lower rate in the north, because why wouldn't that be the case? But the reality is they will use the stamp duty as a yardstick to determine the future of the housing market.
It's definitely a lot of people in the industry thinking that the government, it's not just about the level of where the stamp duty comes in, for example, but how they could be more creative in using it and thinking outside the box. So, for example, the suggestion is that they could be more generous with stamp duty for homes that have got energy efficient home improvements, for example. So people who've invested in the property to make it more green would get more relief on stamp duty, for example. Or there could be waivers on stamp duty for downsizers to encourage people who've got this 6-bedroom house and they're living on their own, or just the two of them because the kids have flown the nest, but they don't want to move because they don't want to pay the stamp duty to move down.
Absolutely. And I recently had a discussion with someone exactly in that position. And, they've got a property that is now perhaps way bigger than what they want to have. It's hard to maintain, needs quite a lot of work doing to it. So, and maybe one person, they can rent some of the rooms out. But the reality is it's the cost of moving that actually sort of stops them, because not only have they got the cost of selling and leaving and legal costs and agency costs, etc., but then they've got a double whammy on the other side when they've got this massive great stamp duty, and that does make people stay where they are. Now, I agree they should be creative, and that could be that someone who is downsizing doesn't have to be paying stamp duty on their move, and that encourages them to perhaps vacate a larger property, or a property that is sitting on a bigger plot that may be converted or potentially taken down and put into flats, so we can actually produce more living space, more properties for people to buy or to rent, and that could be quite a good thing to do. But yeah, they do need to definitely think about the creativity of how they could use that. And the EPC situation for bringing it to the minimum standard of C is being sort of talked about pretty much everywhere at this moment in time. And yes, I think that's what will happen as time goes on. Not only will stamp duty will be a consideration, but even lenders may turn around and offer better rates for those that are actually taking the time and the trouble to get their properties up to a certain standard. And because of that, of his efficiency, it means that when they do their calculation in terms of affordability, these are big words this morning, right, Paul, by the way, and with those things in mind, yes, they would probably turn around and say, well, we could actually offer you a better rate because you have bothered to maintain your property, you have brought it into minimum category of C, and so subsequently, we're going to offer you a lower rate. So yeah, I think there's room for improvement in that, definitely.
Well, we'll follow that story as well, along with all the others that we've discussed today on property matters over coming weeks. And that's all we have time for this week. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you again next week.